house at Hollow Hill. The rain had started just after noon, a steady patter that soaked the ground and filled the air with the smell of wet earth and grass. Emma watched the raindrops slide down the windows, catching the glistening rivulets as they merged and streamed down the glass. She'd been excited about a quiet weekend at home, a chance to finally relax and escape the endless hustle of work. Hollow Hill, her family's vacation house, sat at the edge of town, isolated and cozy, surrounded by thick trees and overlooking a small, dense forest. Emma's parents had left for a weekend getaway of their own, thinking she'd enjoy the quiet time alone. The house was familiar to her. She'd grown up visiting it, spending summers there with her siblings, exploring the woods and collecting odd stones or wildflowers along the trails. But today, the house felt different, as if it were watching her. She shook off the feeling and tried to focus on the book she'd brought with her. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the windows with a rhythmic persistence that had a strangely hypnotic effect. She settled on the couch, the dim afternoon light filtering through the heavy clouds outside. She had just lost herself in the story when a faint creak sounded from upstairs. Emma froze, her gaze drifting toward the staircase at the far end of the room. She listened, holding her breath, but there was only silence. She laughed at herself, chalking it up to the house settling under the weight of the storm. It was an old building after all, with creaky floors and drafty windows that had always added to its charm. But the noise didn't stop. It began again, a series of slow, deliberate creaks, as if someone were pacing back and forth in the room above her. Emma frowned, setting her book aside, and rose to her feet. Her eyes stayed on the ceiling, tracking the sound as it moved across the room and stopped just above her. "Hello?" she called, her voice wavering slightly. There was no answer, only the steady drumming of the rain against the windows and the faint rustle of leaves outside. Emma took a deep breath and walked to the staircase. She'd been alone in the house dozens of times, and she'd never felt uneasy. But something about the rain and the silence, broken only by that strange noise, made her skin crawl. As she climbed the stairs, her footsteps echoed against the wooden steps, mingling with the sound of the rain. She reached the top and glanced down the hallway, but everything was still and silent. She checked each room, her pulse quickening as she opened one door after another, half expecting to find someone hiding in the shadows. But the rooms were empty. She finally reached her own bedroom, the last room at the end of the hall, and hesitated. The door was ajar, and she was certain she'd left it closed. She swallowed, her heart pounding, and pushed it open. The room was empty, just as she'd left it. Her clothes lay folded on the bed, and her laptop sat on the small desk by the window, its screen dark. She let out a sigh of relief, laughing softly at her own paranoia. The house was old, and old houses made noises. That was all. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of something odd. On her bed, right next to her folded clothes, lay a single feather, a dark glossy feather that looked out of place among the neatly arranged items. Emma frowned, picking it up and turning it over in her hand. She hadn't seen any birds around the house, and she certainly hadn't brought one inside. Shrugging, she placed the feather on her nightstand and left the room, heading back downstairs. She tried to shake off the strange feeling, telling herself it was just the gloomy weather playing tricks on her. But as she settled back on the couch, She couldn't shake the sense that she wasn't alone in the house. The rain continued to pour, the sound growing louder, almost deafening, as if the storm had settled directly over the house. The windows rattled in their frames, and the lights flickered briefly, casting long shadows across the walls. Emma glanced at the clock. It was only 4 in the afternoon, but the storm had darkened the sky so much that it felt like evening. She considered calling her parents just to hear a familiar voice, but she didn't want to worry them over nothing. Instead, she curled up on the couch, pulling a blanket over herself, and tried to lose herself in her book again. But the creaking started again, louder this time, and closer. Emma sat up, her heart pounding. The sound was coming from the hallway just outside the living room. She stared at the doorway, expecting to see someone step into the room, but no one appeared. She got up, moving slowly toward the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The sound stopped as she reached the doorway, leaving her in silence once again. She peered into the hallway, her eyes scanning the shadows, but it was empty. A sudden chill ran down her spine, and she shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. The air felt colder, as if the temperature had dropped suddenly, and she could see her breath fogging in the dim light. "Hello?" she called again, her voice barely more than a whisper. The only response was the relentless patter of rain against the windows. She took a step back, her gaze fixed on the hallway, and stumbled over something soft. She glanced down, her breath catching as she saw another dark feather lying on the floor, right where she'd been standing. She picked it up, her hands trembling, and stared at it, her mind racing. This wasn't normal. Someone was in the house, leaving these feathers as a twisted sort of message. She clutched the feather tightly, her pulse racing, and backed away, keeping her eyes on the hallway. As she turned, she caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye, a shadow flickering in the mirror above the fireplace. She froze, staring at the reflection, but there was nothing there, just her own pale face, wide-eyed and frightened, staring back at her. She grabbed her phone from the coffee table, her hands shaking as she dialed her best friend, Sarah. The phone rang, but no one answered. She tried again, her heart pounding, but there was still no answer. She left a quick voicemail, her voice trembling, and hung up. "Come on, Emma," she whispered to herself. "Get a grip. You're just scaring yourself." But deep down, she knew that something was wrong. She could feel it, a presence lurking just out of sight, watching her from the shadows. The rain continued to beat against the house, a relentless drumming sound that seemed to grow louder, filling her ears and drowning out her thoughts. She took a deep breath and headed to the kitchen, hoping to distract herself by making a cup of tea. The familiar routine calmed her nerves, and she tried to focus on the simple tasks, filling the kettle, measuring out the tea leaves, and waiting for the water to boil. As she stood by the stove, staring out the window at the rain-soaked trees, she saw a figure standing at the edge of the yard. It was barely visible through the rain, a dark shape that seemed to blend into the shadows of the trees. Emma's breath caught in her throat, and she backed away from the window, her heart pounding. She watched the figure, her mind racing, but it didn't move. It just stood there, watching her, its face obscured by the shadows. She grabbed her phone again, her hands shaking, and dialed 911. But the call wouldn't go through. The screen flashed no service, and she cursed under her breath, glancing at the window again. The figure was gone. Emma stumbled back, her heart racing, and looked around the kitchen, her mind scrambling for a plan. She couldn't just stay here, waiting for whoever or whatever was out there to make a move. She had to do something, anything, to protect herself. She grabbed a knife from the kitchen drawer, clutching it tightly, and backed away from the window. The house felt colder, darker, as if the storm had seeped inside, filling every corner with its icy touch. As she moved toward the hallway, she heard the creaking again, this time coming from the living room. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, and listened, her senses on high alert. The sound grew louder, a slow, steady creak that echoed through the house. It was coming closer, moving toward her, and she felt a surge of panic, her heart pounding in her chest. Emma turned and ran, her footsteps echoing in the silence as she raced down the hallway. She reached the stairs and took them two at a time, her mind racing as she tried to figure out where to go. She reached her bedroom and slammed the door shut, locking it behind her. She backed away, her eyes fixed on the door, and clutched the knife tightly, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The creaking continued, moving up the stairs, slow and deliberate, as if whatever was out there was taking its time, savoring the chase. Emma pressed herself against the wall, her mind racing, and tried to steady her breathing, but it was impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every echo of the rain pounding against the house seemed to grow louder, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. Then she heard it, a soft scraping sound, right outside her bedroom door. It was faint, almost tentative, like fingernails dragging across wood. Emma's heart pounded as she stared at the door, willing it to stay shut, to keep whatever was outside from coming in. But the scraping didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, like someone or something was clawing at the door. The doorknob began to turn slowly, and Emma's pulse spiked. She gripped the knife tightly, her hands trembling, and took a step back, her eyes locked on the door. Suddenly, the knob stopped turning, and the scraping went silent. Emma held her breath, every muscle in her body tensed, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the rain hammering against the windows. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, until finally the silence became too much to bear. She took a shaky step toward the door, her heart pounding, and leaned forward to listen. Then, without warning, a loud bang shook the door, the force of it sending a shockwave through the room. Emma stumbled back, stifling a scream as the door shuddered under the impact. Another bang followed, then another, each one more forceful than the last, until the door was rattling in its frame, threatening to give way. She backed into the corner, clutching the knife, her eyes wide with terror. The banging stopped suddenly, leaving the room in dead silence. She strained to hear, waiting for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Then the faintest whisper drifted through the door. It was soft, barely audible over the rain, but she could make out a single word. Emma. Her name, spoken in a voice she didn't recognize, a voice that sent chills down her spine. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to steady her breathing, but the whisper came again, louder this time, almost pleading. Emma, let me in. She shook her head, clenching her fists, willing the voice to go away, but it didn't. It grew louder, more insistent, repeating her name over and over, each repetition a twisted mockery of the sound, filling her with a growing sense of dread. "Emma, let me in. I need to see you." She squeezed her eyes shut, covering her ears, trying to block out the voice, but it was inside her head now, echoing in her mind, a relentless, inescapable sound that filled every corner of her thoughts. Finally, unable to take it anymore, she screamed, "Leave me alone!" The voice went silent, leaving the room in oppressive stillness. Emma opened her eyes, her heart pounding, and stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open. But there was only silence. She waited, holding her breath, but the voice didn't return. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, until she felt like she couldn't breathe. She took a tentative step forward, her eyes locked on the door, and listened. Nothing. Emma let out a shaky breath, lowering the knife, and took another step forward. The storm outside seemed to be easing, the rain softening, the thunder growing fainter. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, and reached for the doorknob, her hand trembling. Just as her fingers brushed the metal, the lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. Emma froze, her pulse racing, as the darkness closed in around her. She couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything but the pounding of her own heart. She reached for her phone, fumbling in her pocket, and turned on the flashlight, casting a narrow beam of light across the room. The beam landed on the door, and her heart stopped. The door was open, just a crack, and in the gap she could see an eye staring back at her, a pale, unblinking eye that glistened in the flashlight's beam, watching her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Emma stumbled back, dropping her phone, and the flashlight blinked out as it hit the floor. She scrambled in the darkness, her hands searching for the knife, but she couldn't find it. Her pulse thundered in her ears, her mind racing as she backed into the corner, her only thought to hide, to disappear, to escape whatever was watching her from the shadows. Then she heard it again, the soft, familiar creak of footsteps moving toward her, slow and deliberate. The footsteps stopped just in front of her, and she could feel a presence looming over her, its cold breath brushing against her skin. She held her breath, her body frozen with fear, as the presence leaned in closer, and a voice, soft and cold, whispered in her ear, "You shouldn't have come here alone." Emma squeezed her eyes shut, her body trembling, and waited for the inevitable. But the presence lingered, hovering over her, as if savoring her fear. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. The room was empty, silent, as if nothing had happened. Emma opened her eyes, her pulse racing, and looked around, but there was no one there. The door was shut, the darkness undisturbed, and her phone lay on the floor, its screen dark. She took a deep, shaky breath, trying to steady herself, and reached for her phone, but her hands were trembling so badly that she dropped it again. She forced herself to take slow, deep breaths, willing herself to calm down, to think clearly. She couldn't stay here. She had to leave, to get out of the house, to find someone, anyone, who could help her. She grabbed her phone, clutching it tightly, and made her way to the door, her footsteps silent on the carpet. As she opened the door, she heard a faint, mocking laugh echoing through the hallway, a laugh that seemed to follow her, growing louder as she moved down the stairs, filling the house with its sinister sound. She ran, her footsteps echoing in the empty rooms, her mind racing, her heart pounding. The laugh followed her, growing louder and louder until it was all she could hear, drowning out her thoughts, filling her with an overwhelming sense of dread. She reached the front door, her hands shaking, and fumbled with the lock, her fingers slipping as she tried to turn the knob. The laugh grew louder, closer, until it was right behind her, a cold breath brushing against her neck. Finally, she managed to unlock the door, throwing it open and stumbling outside. The rain had stopped, the sky clearing, the first rays of dawn breaking through the clouds. She ran down the driveway, her footsteps splashing in the puddles, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She didn't stop running until she reached the edge of the yard, her pulse racing, her mind reeling. She turned back, her eyes wide, and stared at the house, half expecting to see someone or something standing in the doorway, watching her. But the house was silent, the windows dark, as if nothing had happened. Emma took a deep breath, her body trembling, and backed away, her eyes fixed on the house, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for her to come back. She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the silence, the house fading into the distance behind her. But she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that the presence in the house was still there, watching her, waiting for her to return. And as she walked down the empty road, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, she knew that she would never be able to escape it, that it would follow her, haunting her, a dark shadow lurking just out of sight, waiting for the day when she would come back to Hollow Hill, and it would be waiting for her, ready to finish what it had started.